In our last lecture, we talked about the fact that cells combine together to make tissues, right? So these cells will actually form connections with each other, these intercellular connections that we talked about, tight junctions, gap junctions, or desmosomes. That holds these cells together into what become tissue. Now, there's four types of tissue in the human body: epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. The first one that we're going to get into is epithelial tissue. And what you're looking at in this image is this poor ant has been squashed by this person. But what you're seeing is skin, right? This tough outer layer of skin. That is epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is what makes up our membranes. So let's get a little bit into some of the characteristics that you can find when we're talking about that type of tissue. So there's four characteristics. I'm going to talk about each one. The four characteristics that make up epithelial tissue, all epithelial tissue have this in common, is first, they all have what is called a free or apical surface. So what that means is there's always going to be one side of this membrane that is exposed to an outside or open space. And I'm going to go into more detail on all these individually. Also, all epithelial doesn't have blood vessels. Now that might be very counterintuitive because cells need blood, because cells need oxygen, cells need glucose. It doesn't mean that they don't get blood, it just means that they don't have blood vessels. And again, I'll explain this in more detail. They all readily divide and replicate. They are very good at mitosis. They divide constantly, and that is because they are constantly being worn away, right? Membrane is outer exposed surface. So again, I'll talk more about this. And finally, all epithelial tissue has something called a basement membrane, which anchors it to its underlying tissue. And it's always going to be between epithelial and connective tissue. So let me go into some more detail on each one of those. And I think it's helpful to draw some of this stuff out. So let me bring up my little whiteboard here, and I can do some drawing. Okay, so let's talk about that first aspect. So first off, that apical surface idea. So let's say this is someone's skin, right? And then this would be a thin layer of cells. And we'll talk more about the layer of cells and what composed it. So let's say these are the cells of your skin, and this is inside the body. This will be maybe your muscle layer underneath your skin. And then there's the outer surface. This is called the apical surface. And the apical surface is basically either the air, the open space outside the body, or it could be inside the body. Like, for example, your bladder, right? Your urinary bladder. So let's say you have something like a bladder here. There's going to be an apical surface on the outside, right? Because that's going into your body cavity. But there's also going to be an open space here, right? So that means there's also an apical surface on the inside. So the apical surface could be on the outside and on the inside, because this would be an open space here, an open cavity. So anywhere you have open cavities are going to have this membrane, this apical surface on the inside, outside. Your heart, same way. The openings in your heart, your blood vessels, the inside of your blood vessels. So anything where there's an open space, either inside or outside, that is called apical. So all epithelial tissue have that surface. I want to jump down to the basement membrane idea because this is something that a lot of people have a hard time visualizing. So when you look at a tissue, you can't just isolate one part of a tissue. So you've all heard of a biopsy before, right? So let's say I went to the doctor and they were concerned about a mole I had and they wanted to see if it was cancerous, or I had a skin condition or something where they wanted to explore it further. They would take what's called a biopsy, where they just take a small piece of your skin, or they take whatever, a tissue sample, and then they cut it and they analyze it under a microscope. And it's a lot like an Oreo cookie, right? So like if I have an Oreo cookie here, and I have my opinions on Oreos. They never need to make the double stuff. If you're a double stuff fan, I don't know. Maybe you just like the excess, too much excess. But point being, if this is an Oreo here, the outside, the cookie part, would be the epithelial tissue, because it is the outer portion, right? And then the inside would be the connective tissue. So everywhere in your body you have connective tissue. You also have epithelial tissue on the inside and on the outside protecting it. So if I go back to my skin example, imagine this is the skin. Or if I go back to my bladder example, the membrane would have an outer surface and an inner surface that would be epithelial tissue. And then in between those two epithelial tissues, we have our connective tissue. And there's something called a basement membrane that exists. Here, I'll change the color just to differentiate. Right here and right here, there's a thin membrane called the basement membrane. And the basement membrane anchors the epithelial tissue to the connective tissue. And we'll be exploring that a little bit further. And then the last two components that I talked about on those characteristics here is the fact that they lack blood vessels and they readily replicate. So I just want to explain the blood vessel aspect. That might seem, like I said, counterintuitive because you need blood to function. Just because they don't have blood vessels doesn't mean they don't have blood. The reason why they don't have blood vessels is because epithelial tissue is either 1 or 2 cells thick, which is extremely thin. A cell is microscopic, right? So a 1 cell thin layer doesn't have space for a blood vessel. So think about a vent in your room, right? So you probably have a vent somewhere in your room that's pumping air out. Imagine that's the only air supply you have. You don't have to be right up against that vent to breathe that air. It gets pumped into the room and you breathe it in. That is essentially how that works. So for example, if I go back to this whiteboard here, I can show you in the sense that, let's say this is the epithelial tissue and this is the connective tissue. Now in my drawing, it's not a very good indicator because the epithelial tissue is really too thick compared to the connective, but we're just going to go with this. What would happen is there would be a blood vessel in here. So this would be the blood vessel here in the connective tissue. And even though it's not actually going into the epithelial tissue is close enough to be able to get the oxygen and glucose it needs from that blood vessel. So the epithelial tissue doesn't have its own blood supply, but it's close enough to a blood supply to take advantage of the oxygen and the glucose. And again, we'll explain this further as we go through. And finally, they readily divide and replicate, and that's because of the fact that they make up the membrane. Think of your mouth. If you've ever bitten the inside of your mouth, the inside of your mouth is epithelial tissue, right? It's the outer layer. It heals very quickly. It hurts really bad, and then for a day or two, you're like, oh, that really hurt. But after a day or two, you realize, oh, it doesn't even bother me anymore. That's because those cells have replicated so fast. So constantly replicating, apical surface, basement membrane, keeping the epithelial connected to the connective tissue, and then they replicate and divide very quickly. Couple functions. They cover the body surfaces, so all of your body surfaces are going to be covered with epithelial. Every gland in your body is made of epithelial tissue, and we'll talk more about that later. So anything that has the word gland is actually epithelial. Protective. Obviously, your skin is protective. It's a membrane. Think about why we wear clothes. We wear clothes to cover ourselves, but also to protect ourselves from the temperature, from any damage, from wind, any of that. Absorption is a big part of it. Our intestinal tract and our digestive system has an epithelial layer, which is used to absorb all the nutrients and sugar that we break down when we eat. And then finally, they secrete and they excrete. What's the difference between those two terms, right? Secretion and excretion sound the same. They're actually different. A secretion is when something is secreted into the body, but it stays in the body. So maybe it's secreted into a blood vessel and it travels to, it's a hormone that travels to another organ and it stays inside the body. And excretion, think of the word exit, leaves the body. So like a sweat gland excretes. We have things called sebaceous glands in our hair that secrete oil. Excrete oil. I just said it wrong. So secretion stays inside the body, excretion leaves the body. Okay, last thing is how do we classify epithelial tissue? We classify them by their shape and the number of layers. So I'm going to finish up here. There are 3 types of shape which you can have when we're talking about epithelial cells. They could be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And they're pretty easy to remember because their name sounds like what they are. Squamous, think squashed, right? Think of a cell like every cell you've ever seen a picture of, and imagine somebody stomping on it and squashing it. So a squamous cell is going to be a flattened cell, almost two-dimensional, completely flattened. And they have a specific job, which we'll talk about when we get to the individual types of epithelial tissue. So you can have squamous. You could have cuboidal, which is easy to remember because it's cube-shaped. So if you look down here, you can see squamous is flat, cuboidal is a cube-shaped, and then columnar are tall and column shaped. And you can always tell the cuboidal versus the columnar because of where the nucleus is. If the nucleus is right in the middle, it's cuboidal, and if the nucleus is either down low or up high, it's columnar, and that's how you can tell that difference. And finally, we classify them by the number of layers. So if it's a single layer of cells, it's simple, and if it's more than a single layer, 2 or more, it's called stratified. There is one called pseudostratified, which I'll talk about in a moment, but simple is going to be a single layer, stratified is going to be 2 or more layers. So how do we name these things? We say the number of layers first and then the shape. So for example, simple cuboidal would be a single layer of cuboidal cells. Simple squamous would be a single layer of squamous cells. Stratified columnar would be a multiple layer of columnar cells, so it would be usually 2 in that case. It's not common to be more than 2. There are some that have more than 2, but most layers are either 1 or 2 layers in terms of the thickness of that layer. Lastly, I want to just make sure that we understand what pseudostratified is. So I'm just going to come back to my little whiteboard here. So why is it pseudo-stratified? Well, pseudo means fake, right? So pseudo-stratified. So let's say this is the basement membrane here. And in a normal situation, you would have, for example, this would be like a simple cuboidal. You have a single layer of cuboidal cells. And that would be simple cuboidal. Now, pseudo-stratified, and then what stratified would look like would be if there's another layer. So if this would be a stratified cuboidal because it's got 2 layers. Now, pseudo-stratified would look something, now it wouldn't look exactly like this. This is a little bit ridiculous, but it would look something like this, where you have a bunch of cells that are all branching off of the basement membrane, but they're kind of going up over each other. It's a big mess. It's hard to see what's going on. But what you're seeing here is, it looks like, if you were just looking at it, those are the nuclei, that this is multiple layers, right? It looks like there's a layer here, and it looks like there's a layer here. But if you take a look, all of these cells are still anchored to the basement membrane. So even though it looks like it's stratified, it's actually just a single layer. Okay, thank you very much.